Good morning, everybody. Thank you for your patience as we're starting a little bit delayed. We've gotten word that there are some accidents on the metro, and so that has delayed not only some of our colleagues from participating today, but also our Vice President for the Applied Conflict Transformation Center, Dr. David Young, who is going to be opening this event. So I will be giving his remarks as opening. So my name is Leanne Erdberg. I direct our program on violent extremism here at the U.S. Institute of Peace, and I'm delighted to welcome you here. So as I mentioned, the Applied Conflict Transformation Center is one of the thematic centers here at the U.S. Institute of Peace, and we house a lot of the different ways in which we can understand comparative conflict all over the world. We understand it through the lens of governance and justice, through religion, through different types of inclusive peace processes, and through violent extremism. And so I'd like to welcome you here with that in mind to the launch of the 2019 Global Terrorism Index, or GTI for short. This is the 7th edition of this annual report that's produced by the Institute for Economics and Peace, and this is the 6th annual event that the U.S. Institute of Peace has been glad to partner with IEP on launching for a Washington event. We are proud to continue our relationship with IEP, and you can follow all of our organizations online at USIP, at Econ and Peace, and today's hashtag of Global Terrorism Index. Quickly, for those who are new to USIP, we were founded by the Congress in 1984 as an independent, nonpartisan national institute that's dedicated to reducing violent conflicts internationally that pose a threat to U.S. national security. We do this directly in the field, working in conflict zones around the world, and also by providing people and organizations and governments with the tools and knowledge and training and know-how to how to manage conflict, resolve conflict, so it doesn't become violent, and resolve it when it does. And as many of you know, many of you who are familiar faces here in the audience to USIP, one of the most pervasive challenges that we face today is the rise, spread, and evolution of violent extremism and terrorism, especially as it interacts with existing conflicts and creates new ones and further damages already fragile context. You'll hear a lot about that in today's presentations, and we'll hear from the GTI authors, not only about the trends in terrorism, but some of the stories that are not necessarily straightforward. So while you will hear some things about the progress that has been made to counter violent extremism and terrorism, you're also going to hear about new threats that have been emerging and different countries that have been suffering from attacks. Sorry for the long pause as I'm reading somebody else's remarks. I'm trying to make sure I don't say things that are not outside of my remit. So one of the things that we've realized in the study of violent extremism and conflict is that it's not always clear to see how violent extremism manifests in fragile states and how to mitigate those conditions that are conducive to the threat of violent extremism. What we look at those conditions, we realize that we still have significant knowledge gaps that continue to pose obstacles to knowing how, when, and what works to prevent violent extremism. It's one of the reasons that USIP is really proud to host the Resolve Network, which stands for Researching Solutions to Violent Extremism, and it's a global consortium of researchers and research organizations, policymakers, and practitioners who are committed to a more empirically driven, more locally defined research on violent extremism, as well as sources of community resilience. It's precisely like networks like Resolve and organizations like the Institute for Economics and Peace and the START Consortium and many of our other distinguished panelists, organizations that are represented here today, that are focusing on new ways to translate research and analysis into better policy and practice on violent extremism, help us understand the complexities of terrorism, and develop better ways to address it. Today's panel discussion consists of several leading experts from across the globe, and the presentations about GTI's findings, the main data behind it, and I'm sure we will be presenting everybody here in the room as well as online an opportunity to learn and reflect on research, data, analysis, trends in terrorism, and insights made on progress. We have a very distinguished panel here today. Please allow me to introduce not only our panelists, we're going to have two specific presentations, first from the Institute for Economics and Peace, and then from START, the National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism and Responses to Terrorism. And then we're going to transition to a panel discussion where we will hear both opening presentations from the Counterterrorism Committee Executive Director at the United Nations, CTED, and the Anti-Defamation League, ADL. But let me introduce our individuals here on stage. Your bios are also available online, and look forward to a very robust conversation today. So first, to my right is Serge Strubans. He's the Director of Operations for Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa at the Institute for Economics and Peace, and he will be kicking off today's presentations. Next is Aaron Miller, Principal Investigator at the Global Terrorism Database, START National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism and Responses to Terrorism. To her right is Alexandra Dier, Gender Coordinator at the United Nations Counterterrorism Committee and Executive Director at CTED. And to her right is Ryan Greer, Director, Program Assessment and Strategy at the Anti-Defamation League, ADL. It's my pleasure to moderate this conversation. We will do a couple bits of moderated conversation from the dais, then we'll take questions from the audience, and we're also accepting questions online on Twitter. Please join me in welcoming panelists, and welcome Serge for his first presentation.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Should I? Oh, is this working? Hi, good morning to everybody, and it's really a pleasure. Oh, there we are. It's really a pleasure to be here today, and thank you to USIP to host us for the sixth time. I mean, I'm standing here because I'm considered at the Institute for Economics and Peace as a security and defense specialist, and therefore sent out throughout the world to promote a Global Terrorism Index. So let's go straight into the presentation. So the Institute for Economics and Peace is also a non-partisan, apolitical, and independent think tank that is looking at identify the drivers for peace, and we are able to measure and quantify them and also link them to the economic benefits that emerge after a more or within a more peaceful situation. So next to the Global Terrorism Index, we produce more publications. Our flagship is still the Global Peace Index, launched every year in June. We also have a national index in Mexico. We do some research on the SDGs and the implementation and the SDGs, trying to measure the effectiveness of measures taken in the framework of the SDGs. And of course, we developed a concept of positive peace that is aiming at creating peace, and I would say making sure that countries investing in peace could get to the more economic, social, and governance positive returns of their investments. So what is the Global Terrorism Index? So it's published for the 7th year. We rank 160 countries, so the remaining 30 countries that you won't find on the index are too small in geographical size or size of the population to be integrated in an index. We measure the relative impact of terrorism. We do it ourselves, and it's overseen by a panel of experts. And terrorism is one of the 23 indicators we use to produce the Global Peace Index annually. In this Global Peace Index, we have 3 families of indicators. So we measure the implication in domestic and international conflict. We look at the levels of societal and safety and security, and a third family is looking at militarization or levels of militarization, and terrorism is in the second family. This is the methodology. So we are dealing with soft sciences or social or political sciences. So there is no consensus, global consensus on the definition of terrorism, and therefore to be able to collect data and afterwards process them into an index, you need to start from definition. And definition we use, of course, in collaboration with START, that is putting together the Global Terrorism Database, is the use of illegal force and violence by a non-state actor to attain a political, economic, religious, or social goal through fear, coercion, or intimidation. So we are using the Global Terrorism database, press this through the filter of 4 indicators. So we look at the amount of incidents, people killed, people injured, and property damaged, and we also give a certain weight to each of those indicators. We understand that terrorism is a specific form of violence that is more persistent than others, because you all, of course, have this psychological effect that is linked to the use of terrorism. Therefore, over a period of 5 years, we keep half of the previous impact into the calculation of the ranking for each of the countries. I would say as IEP, we do a statistical job. We also add some socioeconomic indicators, and this allows us to create the Global Terrorism Index every year. So let's have a look at the results first. This is a map, an interactive map that you will find back on our website, visionofhumanity.org. You're able to click on each country you see on the map, and you will get direct access to all data and for each indicators per country. This map also shows you the concentration of, I would say, the phenomenon of terrorism, or the impact of terrorism in the world. And the countries in green, only 26, are countries that did not face a terrorist attack in the past 5 years. So this is the top 10 of the index, so you will find back those countries, I would say, that are common in this type of indexes. Countries involved in an internal conflict or violent conflict, and countries involved in political transformation are linked to the use of violence. What is really important on this one is the fact that Afghanistan is number 1 this year. This is the first time since 2003 that Iraq is not at the top of the index. So you clearly see a shift there where Afghanistan is becoming more and more impacted by terrorism, and where Iraq and Syria and other countries, because, or I would say thanks to international intervention in those regions, are less impacted today by terrorism as they were in the past. The key findings, so we clearly see there is good and bad news there. So we clearly see a decrease of the impact of terrorism, so the amount of death caused by terrorism, by 15%. We see that more countries improved than countries that deteriorated. But we also see that more countries have faced a terrorist attack in the past year. 71 countries have had at least 1 death on their soil, and this is the second highest number of countries impacted by terrorism in the past decade. So you clearly see that terrorist activities, so terrorist groups, are less effective in creating casualties, therefore are also very effective in creating this sentiment of vulnerability and fear within societies. And the phenomenon, or I would say this evil form of violence, is also spreading to more countries. So that's really disturbing when you see this. So less effective, but still the phenomenon or the concept of terrorism is still very, very present in our societies worldwide. I said only 26 countries did not have a terrorist attack in the past 5 years. And for Europe, for example, that is still the most peaceful region of the world, we had a decrease again by 70% last year, with 62 persons killed. But Turkey is within the group of European countries in the index, and Turkey amounted for 40 casualties last year. So if we continue, we need to focus on Afghanistan now, and we see that the Taliban became the deadliest group in the world, overtook ISIS last year, and an increase by 71%. ISIS had a decrease in the levels of the people killed by 70% also. Taliban amounts for 38% of all people killed by terrorism in 2019, and if you would add the other group active in Afghanistan, the Khorasan chapter of the Islamic State, together they amount for 46, so almost 50% of all people killed by terrorism last year fell in Afghanistan. I think that's an amazing evolution to see the Islamic State, that was really the leading organization in the past years, but active in many countries, and now seeing the Taliban and another local actor, this chapter of ISIS, being active in only one country and creating casualties in only Afghanistan. The other countries in the top 5 are Iraq, Nigeria, and Syria and Pakistan. Only Nigeria increased in the number of casualties last year. The 3 other countries decreased the number of casualties last year. And this is directly linked to the, let's say, military action or security and intelligence service actions in those countries. What we also noticed in this year's GTI is the continued increase of the phenomenon of far-right terrorism. In the past 5 years, we have seen an increase by 320% of this phenomenon. So the amount of people getting killed and the amount of incidents in the past 5 years. Last year we had 26 people who died from this far-right terrorism. This year we already count 77, and this was by the end of September when the terrorism index has been compiled. We need to add 2 people who died in Halle, Germany in October, and we were very lucky there that Germans are building very strong doors. Otherwise, we would have had, again, like a mass casualty event like we had in the mosques in Christchurch, New Zealand in March earlier this year. So we clearly see a continued evolution, and I would say when you see those figures, you can only see what the trend will be for the next Global Terrorism Index. Every time we produce an index, peace index or terrorism index, we also try to provide data on the cost of the violence that is occurring. 33 billion last year for the impact of terrorism, the economic impact of terrorism, and you see a clear distribution over the countries most affected, and also which type of loss created this economic impact. You can focus on 33 billion and think that it's a very large amount of money, but please put this in perspective with the overall cost of violence that we measure at IEP, and it is estimated to 14.1 trillion on an annual basis, and this is consistent over the past years. So let's open the time window and look at some trends in terrorism. So this is a very interesting slide because you can give a lot of different interpretations to this slide. So you can look at this and try to imagine this being the 4th wave of terrorism that we have been facing in the past. And of course you can look at the change in influx in the graph and try to identify the acts of foreign policy that could be linked to this influx of the impact of terrorism. What I think is very interesting is to look at the peak we had in 2014, and then of course the action by the international community, military action by the international community, and enhanced effectiveness of security and intelligence forces that led to this steep decrease of the impact of terrorism in the past 5 years. So the question we should ask ourselves is are we close to tackling the problem, or is this just another subwave in a larger wave, and are we going to create another window of opportunity, or are we going to see other groups, other forms of terrorism arise in the coming years? This is a classification of the 4 most deadliest group in the world. So this is reinforcing the point I just made about the efforts by the international community tackling Boko Haram, where you saw a coordinated effect of a national security force in northeast Nigeria, combined with the activities of a multinational joint task force in the surrounding countries, making sure that Boko Haram could not get resources, human resources, material resources, and financial resources in neighboring countries. And of course, the international coalition against Daesh in Syria and Iraq. Therefore, it's even more disturbing to see this constant and almost steep increase of the impact of the Taliban and the Khorasan chapter of ISIL in Afghanistan. When we look at the regions, we clearly see that three regions are most impacted. And this is, I would say, in line with the presentation we gave last year, where we identified the regions to which foreign terrorist fighters, but also ISIL fighters would migrate to after the crush or the Battle of Mosul in 2016 and the crush we saw in 2017. So we clearly identified, of course, the MENA region is still impacted and has been most impacted with almost 100,000 people killed in the past decade. But you clearly see a redistribution to South Asia in conflicts like Pakistan and Afghanistan, maybe moving more to the south to the Philippines, to Indonesia and other countries in the region, but also a redistribution to sub-Saharan Africa. And you clearly saw that, I mean, I'm coming from Europe and everybody was afraid there to see all those foreign terrorist fighters or ISIL fighters migrate to Europe. But from a, I would say, strategic point of view, it makes no sense. You will never send your troops against the strongest enemy, or the enemy that has the best intelligence and security capacities, or the most efficient ones. So the tactics of those terrorist groups is to find places or locations in the world where there is already a violent conflict going on, where the levels of governance and the effectiveness of security and intelligence services is quite low, and they can just plug in, I would say, their techniques, tactics, and procedures into an existing conflict and really thrive on what's happening in other countries. So identifying those three zones in the world, or those three regions of the world, was, I would say, almost quite easy to do so. What is interesting to see also on this slide is really the impact terrorism has had in the West compared to other regions of the world. You already spoke about this, and we of course identified this evolution. I spoke about 320% over the past 4 to 5 years. In figures, when you look at the amount of people and the amount of incidents getting killed by far-right terrorism, this is still marginal in figures compared to the overall phenomenon of terrorism, and especially this ideologically inspired form of terrorism. But what we see is that the movement is really picking up and is becoming stronger every year and every year. So I think it's a good it's time maybe to have a closer look on this movement. And I mean, coming from Europe myself, but this is I would say, a phenomenon that is going on in more Western countries. So when you talk about far-right terrorism, we basically talk about 19 countries in Northern America, Western Europe, and Oceania that are really hit by this type of terrorism. And those are also countries in which political movements, far-right movements, become more and more mainstream, and where the narrative also becomes more mainstream and really accepted, I would say, in daily debates. What we also see is a difference between far-left movements and far-right movements. We will see much more activity from far-left movements, and this is the red line on the graph, so especially in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. So those movements were much more prolific in the amount of attacks, but we see that far-right terrorism was much more effective, creating peaks of attacks that were very, very effective, killing a lot of people when occurring. And the targets used by both movements are also completely different. And of course, so are the motivations of those groups. When we look at the ideologies, this is a slide, it's a very interesting slide because this is showing you the impact today and the impact in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And I was already there, born in 1969. I will turn 50 in about 3 weeks, but I'm not, I would say, I'm not mentally affected by it. I just accept it. So I was there, and I was just, we had a discussion just before coming in and doing our presentation, and I was talking about, facing this in the news every day. When I was a teenager, some bombs went off. I would say at the base of my building by communist combatant cells in the 1980s. So I grew up with this idea of having terrorism around me every day also. So I was not really surprised, and I was not really appalled when it came back in the past decade. But you see a clear difference between the impact in the last decade and the impact we had by previous waves and previous movements. What is also really interesting here is to notice that these religiously inspired forms of terrorism are not the predominant form of terrorism that we are facing today. We see more and more an increased impact from these politically motivated forms of nationalism is also one of the drivers of terrorism today, or at least a form of terrorism that is emerging again. What we also see is that far-right movements or far-right terrorism just thrive on the strength of the narrative. So the narrative is strong enough just to motivate people to start using violence to, I would say, apply the principles of the narrative. So you do not see these large, I would say, almost regional or global organizations that are going to actively recruit, actively, I would say, instruct and train people and create a terrorist that is going to commit an attack. So the patterns that we saw for Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State, for example, are not really patterns that we find back at the moment in this far-right terrorist movement. We also saw, and I just I would throw it in the group, so to speak, that more and more mass shootings in the past about 40 years have been identified as being a terrorist attack. So we classify more and more of mass shootings, and I guess I would say I'm in the country where this is most applicable, although it's applicable also to other countries in the world and other regions of the world. We saw that more and more mass shootings or those mass events received the tag terrorist attack. What we clearly see in the evolution of the past years, we clearly see that security services would really tag violent attacks as terrorist attacks first, to make sure that they get all the necessary or more legal tools to investigate. Regularly, you see that this tag is taking off afterwards and is downgraded to, I would say, regular violent activity or violent crime. So different inspirations and different movements there that is leading to the acceptance or the identification of mass shootings as being terrorist attacks. We also clearly see a clear connection between violent conflict and terrorism. 95% of all terrorist attacks or all terrorist casualties will fall in a country that is involved in at least one violent conflict. So you clearly see that terrorism is used as a technique and procedure by groups involved into a violent conflict. And as I said to you before, these groups are also trying to find those regions of the world where there are low levels of governance, a conflict going on, so they can just plug in their ideology and their tactics and procedure. And so the main driver of terrorism is still violent conflict for 95%, and in the remaining 5%, I would say that there again, 90% of the terrorist attacks are linked to the application of political terror on the population. So application of political terror is no respect of human rights. This is the second main driver of terrorism, which leads almost to the conclusion that when we are looking at the West, for example, where we are not directly having a conflict on our national soil, and where I still expect that we are not applying political terror to a population, we're basically talking about the last % of this phenomenon called terrorism and the impact of terrorism. The more intense the conflict, the more terrorism will be used and the more casualties will fall. I mean, it's almost straightforward to think about this, but figures are clearly showing this over the past almost 50 years. The targets are also completely different. So if you are active in a conflict, you will see that your targets will be almost, I would say, the regular conflict targets. So you will target more police, military, representative of the state or the power of the state, but also your other terrorist groups and non-state militia, non-state actors that basically would be in competition with you in the conflict that is going on. And the more you shift to non-conflict impacted societies, the more I would say the targets become softer, and you will target businesses, journalists and media, and tourists also. The last point I would like to make today is the enhanced connection between gender and terrorism. So what the figures have shown is that we have been facing peaks of, I would say, female perpetrators of terrorist acts. The last peak that is shown on the slide is heavily inspired or influenced by Boko Haram, who started to identify and not only Boko Haram, other groups also started to realize that females were not really at the center of the attention of security and intelligence services, and therefore would not be the primary target for those services. So you would, using females, and in the case of Boko Haram, of course, I guess you all instructed in what happened in those terrorist tactics in the past years. You clearly see like small girls receiving almost as a gift a new rucksack sent into a marketplace, and remotely the device would just explode remotely, and not the girl herself would ignite it. I mean, from my experience in my own experience in Afghanistan, we clearly saw there also the use of burqas, this large clothing where you could not identify if it's a male or a female underneath the burqa, and you also had difficulties to identify the bomb the bomb vest by doing so. So we see there a clear evolution also, but I would say this is more linked to those terrorist groups always trying to have this advantage compared to security and intelligence forces, and always trying to find the weakest place, or the weakest link within the security and intelligence forces, and always keeping this element of surprise when I would say targeting us. We also see that the targets used, or the targets chosen by female perpetrators are different from those by male perpetrators. And female perpetrators would target much more these softer targets like marketplaces, IDP or refugee camps, I would say gathering of people, rather than where you see that the male perpetrators will concentrate maybe more on other militias, so the targets that I spoke about before. So I guess that's it for my presentation. I'm looking forward to the Q&A afterwards and a panel discussion. And please welcome my last slide. It's a little bit of a propaganda slide, but do not hesitate to connect with us. As said, all the research and all the data are available online. And the report, the GTI, is available online also. And please do not hesitate to also check out this interactive map and the other research that we are producing at IAP. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Serge, for such a data-rich presentation. It's now my pleasure to introduce Aaron Miller, who's going to present a bit more on the Global Terrorism Database.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much to IEP and USIP for hosting me. I'm very glad to participate again. I've done this a few times, and it's always a good opportunity to talk to people about the data we collect. So my task today is to give some background on how the Global Terrorism Database is collected. I manage the Global Terrorism Database collection process at the University of Maryland. I've worked on the GTD for about 15 years now. And so I'm going to give just an overview of how we collect the data, and hopefully there'll be some interesting questions about the details and the implications of that for what the results are in the analysis. Is there a trick? Okay. So just by way of background, the GTD is all based on open source information, primarily media accounts of terrorism. It's currently updated through 2018. Data collection is ongoing. We're working on 2019 data collection right now, and it includes more than 190,000 records of terrorist attacks. The data is available on our website, so you can see the URL there. You can go browse the data. You can download the data. And by all means, please give us feedback about the data. So we always, one of the main reasons that we make the data available, aside from the fact that we view it as a public good, is it's actually good for the data collection process to make it available and garner feedback from people who use the data. A little bit of history on the GTD collection process. So the original records were written by hand on 5x7 index cards. We at START, it was actually before START existed, inherited 65,000 5x7 index cards that are in these storage boxes here. We still have them at START, and our first task was to digitize these. These are two examples here. You can really not read them very well at all, but the one on the top left is from attack in Northern Ireland in 1979. And the one on the bottom right is from the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995. So we originally digitized those. A huge undertaking, but we have improved the sophistication of the data collection process considerably since then. We combine artificial intelligence and human intelligence. We try and leverage those to do what each of them are best at, to make sure that we're improving the efficiency of the data collection process and maximizing the efficiency of the data collection process without compromising the accuracy of the data. And so our process starts with about 2 million news articles a day that we have subscription access to that are published from thousands of sources around the world. So from this pipeline, we apply a number of artificial intelligence processes. We do some very basic Boolean filtering to remove obviously irrelevant content, so information about sports, so a basketball article that includes the word shooting, we want to discard that. We want to exclude articles about bombings that are about movies and TV shows, and so we're very much interested in setting those aside at the outset. We use natural language processing for two reasons. One is to help remove duplicate articles, so anytime something happens, the same article might be republished over and over and over again, so we want to remove those duplicates. And we also use NLP to cluster articles together based on their topic similarity, so that when these articles, this content gets to humans, the articles are organized in a way that makes sense, right? They're topically similar. You're not reading an article about Pittsburgh and then an article about Mosul right after each other, but there's some general consistency to how they're ordered. And then the last part of the artificial intelligence processes before we get to the humans is a machine learning model. So we've been training a machine learning model. We started this in 2012 to just do a basic two-part classification. It's like your spam filter. Your spam filter is trying to decide, is this spam or is this not spam? We use a two-part classification for, is this relevant to terrorism? Does this have information about a terrorist attack or does it not? And we run that filter to try and narrow down the pool of articles that our humans then will process through and read. That gets down to, so we start with 2 million. The team reads through a process we call triaging, about 10,000 articles a month. We've got a team of fantastic researchers at the University of Maryland. They go through, and they're the ones who apply the inclusion criteria, who consider the definition of terrorism, who consider what constitutes a single unique event and a single record, and instantiates that record into the database. And then we work with teams of students who fill in all of the details about what happened, as much information as possible about the location of the attack, the target of the attack, the perpetrators of the attack, the weapons and tactics that were involved, and the casualties and consequences of each attack. And they'll record as much detail as possible in our structured data format. And so all of that is documented in our Global Terrorism Database Codebook, which you can download from our website as well, so that it's very transparent how we're defining terrorism, how we're defining all of the individual variables, and so on and so forth. This is just as a side note, I like to drive home to emphasize the importance of how seriously we take the balance between artificial intelligence and human intelligence. And I say that because we do not use automated event extraction from news sources. There are some data collection efforts that use automated event extraction from news sources. This is a table from one of those. This is not Global Terrorism Database data. When you do that, when you use machines to extract events from news sources, you can do really amazing things like make a list of the 15 most frequently assassinated people. This is problematic, obviously, for more than one reason. First, you can only be assassinated one time, and also only 2 of these people are dead. So the concern that we have as we're continually trying to improve our data collection processes, improve the efficiency, improve the speed, is that if we over-rely on artificial intelligence, you end up with sort of some nonsense data. There's another, from that same data set, we learned that between January and February 2015, there were 252 suicide bombings in the United States. Obviously, that's not true. Okay, so this is our definition of terrorism. You've already heard it: acts by non-state actors involving the threat or actual use of illegal force or violence to attain a political, economic, religious, or social goal through fear, coercion, or intimidation. We break this down into a series of inclusion criteria that are in our code book, and we assess every individual case based on these inclusion criteria, whether the inclusion criteria are met and they're included in the database. Our goal is not to solve the problem of defining terrorism. We have accepted that we are not going to solve the problem of defining terrorism. Our goal is to have a decent definition of terrorism, but also provide users with as much context and information and detail as possible so that they can make informed decisions about how to do their own analysis. And so if you have certain expectations that terrorist attacks cannot target combatant targets, that an attack on a combatant target is inherently not a terrorist attack, you will have the information that you need to exclude those from your analysis of terrorism, for example. I'll get into a little bit more detail about the inclusion and exclusion decisions in a moment. This is just the world map of terrorism in 2018. Actually, I think I had a couple more slides. So to the question of inclusion, let me go back. So the question of inclusion decisions, we take into consideration all of the attributes of a terrorist attack, whether or not it was politically motivated, whether or not it was intended to broadcast a message to an audience beyond the immediate victims, and whether or not it was a target against combatant targets or non-combatant targets. We also take into consideration things like, was it intentional? So we don't include things like accidental explosions that took place when someone was preparing an explosive device or something like that. We don't include cases that are personally motivated, right? We don't include cases in which the perpetrators are state actors. And you can imagine a lot of scenarios where it's difficult to know some of these things, right? There's limited information and sometimes even conflicting information on whether or not these inclusion criteria are satisfied. And we build that into the data collection process as well. Again, we're not trying to create clarity where there is none. We just try and keep people informed about the attributes of each attack. And so we have a measure in the database that's called doubt terrorism proper. If you've used the GTD, you might be familiar with the doubt terrorism proper designation, which basically we use to signal that there are conflicting reports about what happened in this attack and why the attack took place and who was responsible for it. We have standards in terms of the source validity, the validity of the original underlying sources that we will take into consideration in terms of how we evaluate the details of each attack. The conflicting information about casualties, for example, is often something that we grapple with. And in conflict zones in particular, so because as you saw earlier, there's a high concentration of terrorist attacks in conflict zones, there are important additional considerations that we try and take into account. So in general, our processes are the same. We evaluate every attack on a case-by-case basis, but we do recognize that there are difficulties presented regarding collecting data in conflict zones, right? Some of them are a lack of clarity over who's responsible for the attack, right? There might be an attack in Yemen, and some sources indicate that the government is responsible, the coalition forces are responsible, and some would indicate that Houthis are responsible for that attack. And there's just genuinely a lack of clarity about who's responsible for the attack, and if we require the perpetrator to be a non-state actor, we would want to exclude those attacks that are carried out by state actors. So that's just sort of one indication of the importance of not sort of assessing the GTD data as if it's in a vacuum, right? These attacks happen in a broader context against a backdrop of other types of violence, other types of non-state violence, other types of state violence, and I commend IAP for doing such a great job of sort of presenting the context of those events more generally beyond just the trends in terrorism. And so finally, what's next? So we are currently, the Global Terrorism Database is currently funded through the end of this year, which you will note is coming soon. But pending funding beyond that, we have some exciting plans about improving the data collection process. We are hoping to do, rather than annual updates, we're hoping to do quarterly updates and allow API access for people who want to programmatically access the database on a more regular basis. We're developing some data collection tools that involve taking text snippets and highlighting portions of the source documents to help identify what types of information and help with our natural language processing and build more machine learning models to facilitate more efficient data collection. We're working on always building out sort of different aspects of the database. And so we've done some work recently on complex coordinated terrorist attacks and identifying the attributes of complex coordinated terrorist attacks in the GTD and creating sort of auxiliary data sets that people can use to evaluate this sort of constellation of tactics and targeting strategies that contribute to a complex coordinated terrorist attack. And then one of the big things that we're excited about doing better and improving on is movement level coding. And so we've known for a while now that individual organizations are not very long lasting as terrorist organizations, right? There are a number of axioms about how short-lived the average terrorist organization is. I think in our data, about 65% of them last less than 1 year. So on this gray bar here, those are the lifespans in gray of terrorist organizations. If you combine terrorist organizations together into broader movements, combining groups that are networked, groups that change their name, groups that undergo leadership changes, that evolve over time and sort of ebb and flow into broader networks, the actual pattern of the longevity of these perpetrators is the opposite, right? So in red, you can see the lifespan of movements is typically more than 10 years, right? And so it's a little bit misleading to focus specifically only on terrorist organizations in isolation because they have much more complex relationships than sort of meet the eye. And when you dig deep into them, you see that they actually form these movements that evolve over time. And the challenge of combating them sort of takes on a different shape. On the right there, you can see that we've done some work initially already for combining the individual organizations, the generic actors, the generically identified actors who are not affiliated with a particular organization but still ascribe to the ideology of the Islamic State network movement and the Al-Qaeda network movement. So there's obviously some overlap between these at various points. And the chart on the right shows the number of countries that have experienced attacks by any part of either the Islamic State or the Al-Qaeda movement over time. And you can see that number of countries, even though the patterns of terrorism of individual groups come and go, overall, the patterns of terrorism conducted by the movements more broadly look entirely different, right? And these organizations that sort of evolve and combine together and break apart have much more challenging sort of patterns of activity and geographic expansion. The geographic expansion, particularly how rapid it has been of the Islamic State, is something that I think we hope to give a bit more thought to going forward. So thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity, and I look forward to any questions you have.
Thank you so much, Erin, and so much important publicly available data that the GTD provides. And so just a big push toward if you have used the GTD, if you want to continue using the GTD, please let it be known to start how important this data is, and also to policymakers and other funders how important it is to fund this type of database. We're going to move into the panel discussion part of this morning. You can see from both the presentations as well as from the report that's on your chairs and available online that there are a few specific topics that are quite timely to this year's report, and that allows for who we have invited to give particular commentary on two specific parts of it, on both gender and extremism as well as the rise of far-right extremism. These are both trends and chapters in the report itself, but I think are also making their way around many different policy conversations in capitals around the world. So it is my delight to introduce Ryan Greer and then Alexandra Dier to give a bit more opening remarks, and then we'll move into a panel discussion. I will moderate at first, and then we'll take questions from the audience. First, Ryan.
Yeah, thank you, and let me say thank you to USIP for holding such an important event, to the GTI team for producing a fantastic annual report, and to start, as always, if you're not using the Global Terrorism Database, you're making a mistake. It's a phenomenal resource, so thank you to everyone. I took two kind of main stories out of my reading of this year's results that my colleagues can check me on whether there's a better story or better interpretation. But here's the two things that I was sort of most interested in. One is, if you can call it that, the good news story of Iraq. Terrorism is still a very serious threat in Iraq, but at the very least, we can conclude that the threat of ISIS does not look quite the same as it did a couple years ago within Iraq. And if you think about kind of how that came to be, it was a comprehensive effort. Now, it's in a war zone, so some of the tools that were used were war tools, airstrikes and the like, but also humanitarian efforts, governance efforts, and kind of a comprehensive global coalition to address the challenge. Now, again, whether it's dropping in the rankings here is for sure a good news story, or whether it's just some progress has been made, we can debate. But at the very least, we can acknowledge that there was a comprehensive global effort to address the challenge, and that there's been some results that have been made. The second story, which is kind of complementary to that, is I don't want to say a bad news story, but a rising challenge, which is to say, we're getting pretty good at addressing comprehensively the kind of worst of the worst, the places where there's the most deaths from terrorism in the most years in a row. We can at least somewhat rise to the challenge. But as the data suggests, as Serge outlined, more and more countries are facing terrorist threats, and there are new threats that are emerging. Far-right extremism is certainly not new, but it is becoming deadlier and deadlier year on year. And the role of national borders is shrinking. I recall, from preventing violent extremism, countering violent extremism 101, if you want to prevent someone from going down the violent pathway, there is no one path, but the radicalization process probably starts with some form of otherization. So seeing your members of your community or members of the global community that we live in as an other, not as a neighbor, not as a community member. I think it's fair to say, as we're seeing from this data and others, otherization has gone global, and it is no longer as responsive to borders. And in particular, we're also seeing this as a rise of far-right extremism, as people are otherized based on being Latino and immigrants, based on being Syrian refugees, and so on and so forth. It feeds into that grievance narrative. And we're also seeing a rise in precursor crimes, the people who believe in that same, what we call in the U.S. domestic terrorism ideology, who also believe in committing hate crimes, whether they don't rise to murder, but nonetheless they're discriminatory crimes committed against those people. Now, I work for the Anti-Defamation League, ADL. It's an anti-hate organization, and we look at extremism through a lens of a pyramid of hate. There is, unfortunately, a lot of bias. So bias is the bottom of the pyramid. If that bias is not countered, if it goes unchecked, it could become overt hate. If that hate is not checked, it could escalate to extremism and terrorism and atrocities. So we seek to counter everything along that sort of escalatory path in a comprehensive whole-of-society way. So again, as Serge outlined, hate crimes are up, far-right extremism is up. In the United States in particular, anti-Semitism has virtually skyrocketed in recent years. Hate crimes are increasing, and domestic terrorism is increasing. Of the 50 murders committed by extremists in the United States last year, in 2018, 49 were committed by far-right extremists, and the one that was an Islamist extremist had been a neo-Nazi who converted to Islam and killed his neo-Nazi roommate. So there's a connection to far-right extremism in all 50. And we're seeing a kind of mainstreaming of otherization, a mainstreaming of hate throughout the Western world, and we're seeing the corresponding trends in violence. I mentioned we view a kind of comprehensive approach to countering domestic terrorism, and that, again, you can debate the level of success in Iraq, but nonetheless, that there was a comprehensive approach there. We recently outlined in a blog post in Lawfare blog a framework for countering domestic terrorism in the U.S. that we think could be sort of generalizable, international, to create an international version of it in that framework. And there were 3 prongs toward addressing the domestic terrorism threat. 1 being government, 2 technology, 3 civil society. In terms of the government, how does the government see the threat of domestic terrorism? Can it be more transparent in terms of how it sees that threat? What is it doing to counter the threat? Can the government use all the tools in its toolbox to counter, again, precursor crimes, if you will, hate crimes? And then lastly, the government can't go too far and use these tools to infringe on civil liberties, because not only is that bad in itself, but it feeds into the same grievance narrative that creates the extremist threat in the first place. So the second sector, technology. Rightfully, technology companies have different tools and requirements on them than the government. Can they use their terms of service not to police speech, but can they use it to prevent ISIS from having a 24/7 coordination platform and white supremacists from having a 24/7 white supremacist rally? Can they prevent it from becoming coordination that becomes violent? And can they do so in concert in an appropriate civil liberties compliant way with the government and civil society? And the third prong, civil society. So we work with the government. As you know, the government cannot create a case against a white supremacist for being white supremacist. You can be an extremist in the United States for good civil liberties reasons, but sometimes these people, all too often, cross the line toward criminality and become violent. And so we can, as a civil society organization, can develop a specialization in understanding trends in white supremacy that the government cannot, and for many good reasons, should not be able to do. So we have a specialization and credibility. In many communities where extremism is on the rise, the government is not going to be a credible messenger in any way. So some civil society organizations have some credibility for some reason or another. And lastly, prevention. So in terms of preventing violent extremists, there are groups of former extremists who seek to pull people out of those movements. There are groups that seek to counter the message of some of these organizations, but nonetheless play some sort of valuable role that isn't the same as the government's by design, but can be complementary to it. So to us, that framework represents a comprehensive framework that we're looking at global, particularly far-right extremism, but global extremism through that lens. And we hope to see governments and other communities take on similar approaches. So let me pause there so that Alexandra can take over and just reiterate my thanks to co-panelists and to USIP. Thank you very much.
Alexandra.
Thank you, Leanne, and thank you so much to USIP for hosting us. I first of all want to congratulate Serge and the IEP team for another excellent edition of the GTI this year, and it was also a pleasure for us at CETA to collaborate with you and contribute to this year's edition with an article by our executive director on gender, which is one of the key trends that you have identified in your report, and I'm extremely grateful actually for IEP for having done that, because I think, the numbers show why this is such an important issue that cannot be ignored, and that has to be part of our conversation on terrorism. But it is still very rare to have that conversation as part of a discussion among the wider security community, rather than just among gender experts. I think we've seen a lot of attention being paid to this phenomenon among people who are interested in gender, who are interested in women, peace and security, but we still have to make an effort to ensure that it is part of a more mainstream discussion on terrorism. And I think it is our role as those who do study gender, more specifically, to make the case and to explain better, and in terms that are intelligible to a non-gender specialist audience, why this issue is so important. And so what we have seen recently is an exponential increase in research on this issue, and I want to give a shout out again to USIP and Leanne and her colleagues who have done some really excellent work in this field. We have certainly also seen a growing awareness among policymakers, and in the policy discourse this is now something that is increasingly included, but we are still lagging behind when it comes to the actual practice and in terms of how to translate our growing understanding of some of these gender trends into concrete policy. But they are these issues that we are going to talk about are extremely relevant, and they are important in terms of how we design our counterterrorism and CVE policies. And I think that the example of ISIL is really the most compelling illustration that shows us both why it is important to incorporate gender, as well as what the real challenges are in terms of doing that well, and really knowing what a gender-sensitive approach to counterterrorism looks like. So think about the fact, and this is the figures are included in the GTI, the huge number of women who traveled to Syria and Iraq from virtually all parts of the world. This was a development that we did not anticipate, and therefore we were also not able to prevent it effectively. We are now today looking at a situation where many of these women are trying to return, and where thousands of them are stuck in camps in northern Syria, facing a really horrific humanitarian situation, as well as a very precarious security situation. And what we're seeing in terms of government's responses to that is a massive challenge. They do not know how to address this issue. And the failure to understand some of these gendered factors is one of the main underlying reasons for that. The challenges lie in understanding the very complex motivations that underlie women's participation in ISIL, the fact that we don't know why so many of them traveled voluntarily. We are still struggling to understand how many of them did so voluntarily versus those who were coerced or manipulated to do so. We are then looking at the very complex roles that women played during their time in the caliphate. We're looking at a whole spectrum of different roles and functions that they performed. We've seen some of them being violent perpetrators. We've seen many others supporting the organization in other ways. As in the online space, promoting ISIL propaganda, recruiting others to join. We've seen an important role that women played as sort of the backbone of ISIL's state-building project, as mothers giving birth to the next generation of ISIL fighters. And we've seen many women, of course, being victims of ISIL in that context. And so understanding these roles and understanding also often the very blurred boundaries between those different roles is a challenge, and understanding in that context the degree of individual agency that these women have had, and therefore the degree of their criminal responsibility is something that is extremely challenging, and that translates directly into difficulties when it then comes to developing risk assessment processes for these women that would allow us to judge when making decisions about repatriations, for example, to assess the risk that these women might potentially pose. It is a challenge when it comes to the investigations and prosecutions of these women, determining criminal culpability, being able to collect admissible and sufficient evidence, looking at crimes that are not necessarily violent crimes, and so the level to which they are criminalized in different national jurisdictions varies. And then in terms of rehabilitation and reintegration, again, still a lack of understanding of good practices and what the best approaches are to specifically dealing with the rehabilitation and reintegration of women. So all of these are very concrete examples that show that really the failure to develop more gender-sensitive approaches and to build up our knowledge on these issues has led to a massive challenge for governments in the current context. And so I think this is really a perfect illustration for both why we need to be paying more attention to gender and also why we still have a lot more work to do when it comes to developing guidance and good practices when it comes to developing gender-sensitive approaches. And that is certainly something that at the United Nations and my office CTED specifically, we continue to work on and see it as one of our priorities going forward. And having better data is an essential requirement for that. And this is also a challenge that we are facing in this space, that unfortunately still many governments, many national authorities are not systematically collecting gender disaggregated data. And so that means that we are still often struggling to understand the scope and scale of the phenomenon that we are dealing with. And it is only through better data that we are able to understand these issues and to also be able to ask the right questions and more nuanced questions. And if you look at some of the data, Sergio didn't present it here, but it's in the report, the numbers of women who traveled to join ISIL. Women are believed to have constituted around 13% of ISIL's membership, but if you look at the regional differences, they are vast. And so knowing that and having those numbers then allows us to ask, well, what were the context-specific push and pull factors in each of the regions that led in some cases more women and in some cases fewer women to join ISIL. So going forward, I think this is an area where we'll continue to see more interest, and where we have a lot of need for more information. I want to make my one point: our discussion here today and the data in the GTI, and also CTAD's contribution to it, is very much focused on the issue of women as terrorism perpetrators, and we discuss a little bit in our article some of the risks and challenges associated with how we think of women as violent perpetrators in terrorism. But I do want to point out that that is only one dimension of thinking about gender and terrorism. It is equally important to think about the role of women as agents in counterterrorism and CVE, where many of them play a very important, positive and transformative role. Looking at gender dimensions also includes looking at the specific gendered impacts and the way that women are affected by both terrorism and counterterrorism. That is another important area where more work is needed. And finally, if we're talking about gender, then we're also not just talking about women. And so applying a gender lens to the study of terrorism also means looking at the gender dimensions of male participation in terrorism. And so whether that is looking at how terrorism relates to gendered power structures, how terrorists use and exploit notions of masculinity, and also how we can use and promote positive notions of masculinity in our counterterrorism and CVE responses. So I just very briefly wanted to touch on some of those other issues that are part of a gender discussion in terrorism, and I'll leave it at that and look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much for both of those opening remarks that really, I think, start guiding us down the path of how we can take trend-level information and really make those next steps towards policy-relevant conversations, as well as the practice itself. And so with that, I'm going to take moderator's prerogative and ask maybe a first question to all of the panelists. I say this as we're housed at we're here today at the U.S. Institute of Peace, and that the authors of the Global Terrorism Index is the Institute for Economics and Peace, and so I'll go with the peace-building theme. Oftentimes when we see the overall trend lines of deaths going down, we assume that it's for military means that we're able to see such positive progress. But I would pose maybe our first question to the panel to how do we understand some of the peace-building success stories, and is it possible to have more efforts of prevention and peace even in the biggest hotspots where conflict and terrorism are so deeply intertwined?
Yeah, I think if you look at deaths from terrorism, they might go down year on year, but they're still pretty historically high globally. So the threat is still pretty severe there. And then, like I mentioned, of course, we should focus on the areas where terrorism is the most severe, and there are the most deaths there, particularly in war zones. But there's a particular type of tool we can use in those areas that we can't use elsewhere. And I would look at the cyclical nature of when those tools are used, and then when the kind of unintended consequences maybe take effect, in terms of if you're in an unintended way decimating local governance and community structures, then the same form of extremism is going to come back with a new name, as we saw in Al-Qaeda and ISIS, and there will be another generation of that challenge. And so I hesitate. I mean, of course, we should look at deaths from terrorism as a key metric, but particularly looking at it in a 2-year time frame or a 3-year time frame, and not looking at the kind of cyclical nature of the extremism that can escalate. I love that IEP also has a positive peace index. I wonder about creating a positive, countering extremism index, so we can measure the results of efforts in local communities to prevent hate from becoming extremism and extremism from violence. And I think if we were to overlay that index and the GTI index, we might see a broader story about successes about extremism that is reduced or eliminated in an enduring way, versus extremism that is terrorism, that is reduced year on year. But I do think it's an important metric. I don't want to deny that's an important metric, but I think a comprehensive view is certainly important. And as I mentioned, extremism kind of going across borders is another dimension that I might mention, that just because there are fewer foreign fighters going to Iraq, that's definitely a success story. But some of them it's because they're committing extremist acts in Philippines, Libya, et cetera. And so I don't necessarily want to kind of let a national level success story at the expense of the global story be the one we primarily talk about. I think, as I mentioned, we need a comprehensive effort on the global stage, whole of society, but also kind of whole of diplomatic partners. You look at the 70 or so countries that joined the Counter-ISIS coalition, and that should be kind of the way we address all extremism issues, because it is going to migrate across borders.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we have made progress in sort of this more comprehensive and holistic understanding of how tackling terrorism and violent extremism relates to wider peace-building activities. And I think we've seen that sort of translate onto the policy level. If I look at the United Nations, for example, many of our departments and agencies that address issues of conflict prevention and peace-building have traditionally been very reluctant to touch anything that had the terrorism or violent extremism label on it. And that has changed in recent years. And there has been a growing understanding that this is really a challenge that is central to a lot of the work that we are doing in conflict-affected countries, precisely because there is that link between conflict drivers and terrorism. And so I think we need to sort of continue to think about what more we can do to break down some of those conceptual silos and policy silos, and how to integrate our analysis of conflict and of how we look at terrorism. And I do actually want to bring in the gender dimension into this once again, because one of the indicators that we have not talked about is actually gender equality, and how that has been shown to be correlated to the likelihood of conflict, right? And countries that see greater levels of gender equality also see greater levels of peacefulness and stability. And so again, I think there are questions out there around how do we bring that into our understanding of violent extremism. We know that actually a growth in sort of gender-based repression can be one of the most effective predictors, early indicators of a potential rise of violent extremism. And so how do we bring that into our responses? How do we have a truly sort of holistic approach to these challenges? And so again, I think this shows why the data is so important, because these indicators can really help us do better analysis and therefore design better policies.
It'll go on when you speak. No, I agree with everything that's already been said, and I'll just sort of pick up where Alexandra left off about the challenges of collecting comprehensive data on peace building, right? Is pretty tricky. I think a lot of the metrics that are available are more macro level measures, but getting really good granular information on efforts that are happening on the ground is very challenging, and it's particularly challenging to do worldwide, right? And to come up with sort of a comprehensive assessment. But I do think that that's a worthwhile goal, right? I think it's an important objective to try and continue to build out the comprehensive understanding that we have of how all of these things factor in together. What are the costs and benefits of counterterrorism, whether it's from a military perspective or countering violent extremism perspective? There are a number of contexts throughout history, that you can see situations looking at the Global Terrorism Database trends where terrorism declines rapidly, and you think, what, we should do more of that. What is that thing that happened in that country, in that place, in that conflict? Let's do that again elsewhere. And it's not always good. It's often actually very, very bad. So, the decrease of terrorism is obviously a welcome development, but it is often at a tremendous, tremendous cost that needs to be taken into account as well.
Well, first of all, when you look at the two main drivers of terrorism, violent conflict is the most impactful one. As I said, 95% of all attacks occur in a country engaged in a conflict. So I guess any peace-building effort in trying to reduce the amount of violent conflicts going on in the world, and also trying to reduce the intensity and the longevity of these conflicts, especially when they internationalize, because most of the conflicts are internal, might internationalize and last longer and be more intense. Every effort done in fighting those violent conflicts, or basically preventing them, is welcome. The second driver is political terror, or I would say no respect of human rights, and this is linking directly to what Alexandra said. Gender equality is, especially to me, a basic human right, and if you start respecting human rights, automatically the level of grievances will go down, and I would say the occurrence or the potential for terrorism to thrive will go down also. I think when we look at the results, we see this decrease, and this for the fourth year, of the amount of casualties by terrorism. So as Ryan said, we are very good at tackling the consequences and taking away the potential and capacities of those terrorist groups to harm us. But we do not really have an action on the basic motivation of those groups, on the grievances in all societies, but also in the global societies that could lead to the use of violent extremism. And this is where at IEP we use this concept of positive peace, that is trying to create more resilient societies. And what we want to work on is on those root causes for violence and root causes for terrorism, those grievances that will lead to the use of violence in different forms. So I guess we are very good at tackling the consequences, but we are not so good at preventing. So I guess we need to invest more in. So we invest a lot now in making sure that nobody can press a button or pull a trigger, but we need to invest more in making sure that nobody just thinks about creating a device that could explode or shoot, I would say. Thank you.
So this question is somewhat connected to the last two answers, but I mentioned in my opening remarks that USIP is proud to host the Resolve Network, which is really a commitment to research on violent extremism. And one of the activities that we do from time to time are what we call research agenda setting workshops, where we ask a variety of people who are studying specific trends in a specific place to ask themselves, what are some of the unexplored gaps that we would like to see more empirical research on, or more rigorous understanding of some of the most complex things. And so one of the questions that I would like to ask you all is, it's with some of the more trend level data in hand, what are some of the most perplexing pieces that we think are relevant for policymakers, that at first glance at the trend you may draw some conclusions, but if you were really to have more rigorous research on it, you might be able to see some other ones?
Yeah, I mean, I think the answers to the last question started to hint at this, but let me be more direct. The global community, such as it is, started to fund countering extremism efforts on a really small scale, and not necessarily to include with that funding to measure the results of those efforts. So we have some measurements of kind of the return on investment from a kind of extremism prevention program, and those that we have are promising. But we don't have nearly enough to truly know on kind of in a scalable way, kind of what works, like I said, beyond kinetic and coercive sort of law enforcement and war tools, but to prevent the kind of next generation figuring that out. The second element that I would point to is the role of the internet, and people tend to sort of look at it as, oh, it's an internet problem, but the internet is a tool. And so really the question is, how is this tool used by the humans, or in some cases bots, behind it, and how does that actually factor in, not just as, oh my God, the internet, it's scary, but in a rigorous way, how does extremism spread from one platform to another, and what has kind of worked in a civil liberties compliant way to protect people from being harmed on those platforms or harm coming from people who've used those platforms, right? And so I'd say kind of an online hate and extremism, index in a comprehensive way that's kind of challenging to deal with, but nonetheless is central to this problem in this kind of day and age. And the third element is I mentioned hate crimes and bias and how these things escalate to become extremism, which is to say, some extremists, particularly on the far right, seek to mainstream their views. Others seek to become more violent and kind of almost look like an ISIS-type group with a far-right ideology. How can we look at kind of the escalation and nuance in terms of how it relates to systemic racism, how it relates to misogyny, and how it relates to some of the other social ills that are beyond the actual sort of blunt instrument of the security threat? I think those are some of the areas that I would look at. They're big. They're underfunded. If you're out there and you're a funder, please provide some researchers like Leanne and others and Aaron with the resources to look at these things, because we just don't have the tools at our disposal to take a comprehensive view. We keep looking in a siloed way at tangible problems we can wrap our head around, which makes sense, but we really need to look kind of a little bit more comprehensively about social, technological, and preventive factors.
Yeah, so I want to fully second Ryan on the issue of we need to know more about what actually works. And so I would say that impact evaluations is still a huge area where we need more of. And in terms of looking at it from the perspective of what is effective, what does work, but also in helping us understand what some of the unintended and adverse effects might be of the many programs and interventions that we are designing and putting out there, and where these things have not been sufficiently measured yet. And it's very clear that the sort of do no harm principle is the foremost principle in everything that we are doing in this space. And so for that to kind of have the evidence base to know where there are potentially adverse consequences is something that is really important. So and of course then to guide us in terms of good practices, what does work, but what is also compliant with human rights, what ensures that we are not just perpetuating some of the challenges that we are in fact trying to address. So that I would say is a huge area for future research. I would then say, well, I've already mentioned that in the gender space there is definitely need for more robust data on all kinds of questions, really. And that would also allow us, one thing that is really missing in that space is also a more sort of cumulative knowledge in terms of going beyond just single case studies, of which we have seen more and more, but we have seen very little by way of comparative analysis and research that allows us to draw some more generalizable conclusions about the phenomenon that we are looking at. So that would be another issue. And then it's new forms of terrorism, I think, whether that is sort of the evolution of the extreme right or potentially other new forms of terrorism that we are beginning to see emerge. And so that is, I think there has been such a huge focus on, let's say, Islamist-inspired terrorism in recent years. And I think as we're sort of moving on and seeing other forms of terrorism emerge, there will be an important need to kind of make sure we don't overlook other manifestations of terrorism, and that we are also, it will be interesting to see to what extent we can apply some of the lessons we have learned over the past years when it comes to ISIL, Al-Qaeda type of terrorism, and what differences we're going to see. I think that's going to be another very, very interesting area to look into.
I agree with everything that's been said so far. I'll add to that there are, it's hard to choose where to focus on in terms of, what information would be valuable to have. I'll focus from my perspective, having worked on the Global Terrorism Database, is one of the things that I've seen among analyses of the GTD. The GTD is an event-level data set, and so all of the details about about an attack that are in the Global Terrorism Database are really limited to what happened on this day at this time, and it takes a fair amount of additional work to, as you can see, as IEP has done, to sort of make broader assessments based on that information and draw broader conclusions. I spoke earlier about the importance of movement data and taking the information that we have about events and aggregating that into movements. And I think we need to do more of that. We're working on a number of projects on that now. One of the ones that we're working on now, I mentioned that we already worked on it for Islamic State and for Al-Qaeda. We're working on doing essentially the same thing, but for far-right extremist perpetrators of terrorism. And the reason that this is important, or one of the reasons that this is important, is because people use the term far-right, and it doesn't really have a particularly good definition or clear definition. And so you overlook, it turns out, a lot of important information about, well, what does that mean? Why are these people carrying out these attacks? They fall into this general category of far right. And so what we've been doing is going through all of the attacks in the GTD, I think back to 2000, and evaluating what are the specific ideologies associated with this, which the GTD currently doesn't really allow for, right? If there's an attack targeting a synagogue in Pittsburgh, and the person's not a formal member of an organization, so we're recording information about the perpetrator organization responsible. There's no perpetrator organization. This is an individual. Well, individuals have a lot of characteristics or ideological identities that they contain, and so, well, we're recording the information about how we want to describe this perpetrator in the Global Terrorism Database that then everyone is going to use in their analysis. You say, well, we can put this person down as an anti-Semitic extremist, certainly. Other labels would also apply. White supremacist. He had some anti-immigrant inclinations as well that were relevant to choosing that target. And so these ideologies sort of overlap in very complex ways that are a little bit difficult to put into an Excel spreadsheet. And so we need to sort of think about how that works and how these movements, these specific movements using specific terms, overlap to produce violence. And so we're marking all of the attacks down for all of the a comprehensive assessment of the ideological identities that were relevant to someone carrying out a particular attack, right? You can be white supremacist, also anti-black, also male supremacist, also, right? We actually came up with, I think, 20 different categories that specifically can characterize all of these attacks. And far right also includes anti-government, which is a very different and distinct movement of people ascribing to a certain ideology. And so we're trying to tease apart the sort of the composition of what is making up this increase in far right violence that we've seen in the past few years.
Ryan, you had a two-finger?
Yeah, just really briefly, I'll let Serge continue. But let me just second something Aaron pointed out, which is about and Serge had data on this, which is the level of unaffiliated people as a proportion of extremist groups in general and far-right extremist groups in particular. If you look at kind of the difference between a jihadist movement like an ISIS and a far-right adherent, particularly white supremacy and other groups, but this is true in a lot of entities across the far right. In the case of ISIS, you have a defined group, particularly true of Al-Qaeda, but a relatively defined group, and individuals who pledge allegiance to it. In the case of Al-Qaeda, heavy vetting to even get in. In the case of ISIS, anyone can join, but you have to pledge allegiance. And so you might be in Texas and pledge allegiance to a group in Iraq and Syria. But keep in mind how this actually helps policymakers in a way, because once you say, I'm a member of this group, then the policies that address you, the person in Texas, are derivative of how we approach that group. So once we designate ISIS as a foreign terrorist organization, we at least somewhat know what to do with this individual in Texas who's pledging allegiance to them. As Aaron alludes to, in the case of far-right extremists, they either are not members of a group, they jump from group to group, the groups change, the groups change based on, getting sued, they change because there's torrid affairs among the members, they change because of sort of ideological movement, and they change much more frequently than the Jihadist sense, and you're not necessarily pledging allegiance, you're going from group to group and kind of not necessarily attaching yourself to one or the other, which then adds this new layer of complication for how to address it, which is to say, I don't know where you fit in my legal structure. I know where the ISIS person fits, at least relatively speaking. I'm not sure, kind of, are you just a regular person with controversial political views, or are you potentially a violent extremist? And it adds this kind of new layer of complication. I just wanted to second and just add that to Aaron's point. But Serge, I didn't mean to cut you off. Go ahead.
No, I don't feel offended at all. I think research should concentrate on, I said it before, to me the use of violence and the use of terrorism is the end of a process, and is a consequence of grievances and I would say other elements within this process. At IAP, I spoke about positive peace, but we basically, when we do so, we look at creating more equal, equitable, and inclusive and resilient societies. Societies that are able to settle differences, to settle disputes, to address grievances in non-violent ways. When you spoke about silos, positive peace is a systemic. We see peace as a system. If you want to work with silos, you can work with the 8 pillars of positive peace. One of those pillars, for example, is free flow of information. We can look at how the internet is used, how the internet should be used. So enough, I would say, incentives to do specific research in basically creating societies in which violence should not be a way to settle disputes, or at least make your point. When you look at those countries that are topping both a Global Peace Index and a global and or Positive Peace Index, those are usually countries that have a political system that is based on a liberal democracy. And so this explains to you that those are political systems that allow, I would say, individual participation in policy making and in influencing your governments. Those are systems that will provide to you a large palette of different legal and democratic means to influence government and to make your point, to address your grievance and make sure that your government can take it into account and maybe solve it through policy or through, I would say, a change in policy also. What we see is that when those legal tools and democratic tools are reduced by the use of political terror, by discrimination, non-access, alienation from groups of people to those tools, this is where the decision is made faster to use violence to make your point or to address some grievances, inequality or injustice. So I guess if you want to do research on those factors that are creating more resilient, equitable, equal and just societies.
Thank you, everybody. So we're going to move to the audience Q&A. We have had a couple questions in from Twitter, but I'm going to first move to the audience, and then I'll grab the Twitter ones. So I'll just ask that you raise your hand. I'll call on you. If you could quickly identify yourself and limit the question to be a question. If you have a comment, please feel free to have comments after the close of the session directly to our panelists. So if there are any questions, we have mic runners at both sides, and I'll call on you, and the mic will go to you.
Hi there, I'm Matt McCandless at Department of State, Counterterrorism Bureau. Question is to colleagues at START and IAP about whether you've ever contemplated trying to come up with a way to measure the political value of an act of terrorism. An act of terrorism is a means to an end. The end is political. There are things that one might observe within an ecosystem that you could contemplate trying to measure over time. And part of the reason that this would be important is, an incident of violence that kills X number of people on one date and a similar act of violence in the same location that kills a number of people on a different day might have completely different impact politically?
That's a really fantastic question. I kind of love that question. I mean, the answer is we haven't done it. It's certainly something to think about, because you're absolutely right. I mean, there are attacks that take place in advance of elections to influence the election. There are attacks that are designed to trigger a disproportionate reaction on behalf of the state, and so they have secondary and tertiary impacts. I do not know how you would do that. I mean, I think it would be sort of interesting to try to. Yeah, we should, for sure. I think it would be interesting to try, and it's a lot of things that we come across. This is a good example of the kind of thing when we're doing the data collection. We're reading news articles about these things. The news articles contain information about the context, what's going on, what's happening, that we sort of struggle to capture in any kind of systematic way. And I think that there are always, we call it information that's on the cutting room floor, right? We have a certain mandate to collect the data and not get distracted by interesting side projects. But yeah, I think that's a really great question, because it is explicitly the intention of these assailants for their attacks to have follow-on effects, and figuring out a way to capture that would be really interesting.
Well, I mean, I will brief your colleagues next week, just in about a week from now. So I could say, well, give me the week to try to find an answer to your very interesting but difficult question also. And I got a similar question a couple of weeks ago in Paris at Sciences Po, where somebody asked me, well, you look at this ideologically inspired forms of Salafi terrorism, but how much political Islam is there involved in this movement? And I think that and so the easy answer for me would be, well, to get back to my presentation, and the slide where I showed the different the distribution of the motives for the use of terrorism, where political motives were larger than the ideology or nationalism. But I think I can try to go further in answering my question, your question. When you look at the figures for Afghanistan and the Taliban, last year we saw there were elections going on in Afghanistan, and you have the negotiations where the Taliban can come to the table. When you look at the eventual goal of the action of the Taliban, it's to destabilize the government that is in place in Afghanistan at the moment, and basically in some form of insurgency. And I think this is one of the main differences between terrorism and insurgency. It's like a terrorist would like to influence a government, an insurgent would like to become the next government. So there is a political, I would say, underlying motive in every action that is made there. And we see that most of the conflicts that we see today are internal conflicts, most also based on insurgency. And one of the phases of an insurgency, the third phase, is the use of terrorism to basically destabilize so much a government and a system that you can become the next government. So the fact that we had elections, the fact that the Taliban wanted to strengthen their position on the negotiation table through the use of violence in the country, there is a clear connection there between this enhanced amount of attacks and casualties and the political process going on in this insurgency, in those elections, and in the negotiation in which Taliban are invited to the table. This would be my personal analysis of what on your question. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, just real quick, I'll follow up on that. I think more directly, it calls to question whether if the GTI is a macro level assessment, whether a kind of meso and micro level assessment of each attack and its impact could be something that we could tackle. And I'd be very interested in the impact of hate and some of these, like I said, kind of precursors, that kind of pre-escalation to terrorism. But even also how the groups are sort of using each other as a justification for their grievances, and it becomes kind of cyclical in the sense of ISIS is using white supremacists in their propaganda and vice versa. So the impact is a continuation and an exacerbation of other types of conflict. Just to give one data point, following the Tree of Life synagogue attack in the U.S., Moonshot CVE, a counter-extremism company, did an analysis of people using Google to search for for things that suggest that they are interested in joining a far-right group, those searches went up 92% in the immediate aftermath of the Tree of Life attack, and specifically related search terms that suggest people were interested in committing violence against Jews went up 182% following the kind of immediate aftermath. And so there's kind of these second-order effects that I think tell in some ways even a more compelling story.
Other questions?
Hi, Doug Padgett, also from State. I wanted to drill down a little bit on the, I work on human rights at State. I'm in the Religious Freedom Office, and I wanted to drill down a little bit on this sort of context, the hate crimes context, the bias context, and because my completely unscientific sense is that we tend to privilege certain kinds of violence as terrorism and deprivilege other kinds of violence as not terrorism. Terrorism has a cachet in our politics, and I'm not accusing you of doing any of that at all, but I'm wondering how you wrestle with it, because and maybe you fully capture it, but we do see a lot of hate-motivated violence, not necessarily deaths, but vandalism on up, different kinds of violence. We track lots of anti-Semitic, anti-Muslim, anti-immigrant attacks or sentiments that typically aren't included in our terrorism context. And I think it goes to what Ryan's saying about that climate, and it's really at the heart of what we try to do in the CVE world. We're trying to address the broader context. And I know that you're wrestling with how to understand the relationship between movements and groups and the convergences of incels with white supremacists, with anti-Semites and anti-Muslims and anti-government, and it's a very, very difficult thing to do. But I still get the sense that, at least in Europe and the United States and New Zealand and Australia and other countries like that are not in conflict zones, that we tend to see we have very different categories for these different kinds of violence. And my goal is not to securitize or make terrorism, broaden the aperture of terrorism, but to ensure that we're adequately capturing those other kinds of violence in our thinking about just viewing as sort of anti-violence policy. So I'm just curious if you have reflections on how you struggle with that, if you do, or if you're. I know you already actually addressed some of that in your speech, but I just wanted to ping you again.
No, that's a fantastic point, a really great question. I entirely agree with everything you said. As a practical matter, when we're collecting the data, our decisions about whether we include something in the Global Terrorism Database or not, come down to these inclusion criteria. We have sort of fairly extensive coding notes about how we apply the inclusion criteria, and as a practical matter, for the difference between what we would call terrorism and hate crime, it's certainly not a sort of bright line, right? There is overlap there. There are some terrorist attacks that are also hate crimes. There are some hate crimes that are also terrorist attacks. The distinction that tends to differentiate between them for the purposes of the Global Terrorism Database is that we would not include an attack that is sort of spontaneous or impromptu. I'm at a bar and I yell a racial slur at someone and assault someone or something like that, or something that sort of arises from an altercation. This is not to say that that's not terrible, right? That those types of events, particularly given the frequency of them, right? These types of more everyday occurrences deeply impact the quality of life for people, and so we grapple with it a lot. I try to. You are right that the term terrorism has a certain weight to it that I honestly wish it didn't. I am baffled. I'm genuinely and deeply baffled in many ways. I mean, in some ways I'm not, because there are certainly high-profile, extremely devastating attacks that sort of gave the term terrorism the weight that it has, and so I understand that. But if we were going through an exercise of characterizing the degree of badness associated with violence, I don't know. Really know how you would do that, right? Domestic violence is not terrorism, but it's really, truly, and deeply awful, right? And so I encourage people to avoid, making sort of qualitative judgments about the badness of something based on the use of the term terrorism. It's just. It's not appropriate. It's not. If you think about it, it's not practical, right? The things that terrorist attacks don't often impact someone's everyday life in the way that hate crimes do. So if you're weighing priorities and what matters, you sort of have to puzzle through this a little bit. So yes, while we collect data on terrorism, it's not to the exclusion of the importance of these other types of violence. I think in terms of the priority of collecting data on other types of violence, there are just some sort of essential practical issues. Because of the frequency of creating the global the global hate crime database would be impossible, right? I don't know if that's possible, right? Because of the scale, because of the scope. And so there are practical considerations with doing that. As a substitute for that, individual countries may collect their own data on hate crimes. Individual jurisdictions may create their own or collect their own data on hate crimes. But it's certainly a bit of a tapestry, and there are important gaps that need to be addressed. But I think it is a mistake to assume that because we are collecting data on terrorism, it's the only type of violence that is significant, particularly when you're considering sort of the everyday life of citizens around the world.
Yeah, let me start with the disclaimer you ended with, which is, sometimes terrorism and hate crimes and other things are rightfully separate. Sometimes they are a symptom of the same cause, and so we should talk about them together. And not a fun answer, but I think the answer to thinking about these challenges in context is seeking to provide that context. So, for instance, at ADL, we collect annually an audit of anti-Semitic incidents, which includes vandalism, as you mentioned, and also, assaults against Jews that aren't necessarily, it's because they're Jewish, but not necessarily rising to the level of a terrorist attack. It's a harassment of some kind. We look at kind of the most commonly used stat that we use is murders by extremists, because in some cases it's lethal, but it might not reach the level of a threshold where you feel comfortable calling it terrorism, and so that really important metric of lethality is included in murder, but it's not necessarily a terrorist act, although sometimes it is. And so we try to kind of collect information across the board, available online at our hate, extremism, and anti-Semitism and terrorism, or HEAT map, for download if you're interested. But I think kind of also at the crux of your question is the interplay between the policy responses. And we see one as this thing that it's an emergency, terrorism emergency, and we see hate crimes as kind of not the level of emergency. And that's part of again, I would call it a comprehensive approach in which we merge the two issues, not in terms of the tools we use, but in terms of the priority that we give to them. So for instance, a couple tools that we are sort of interested in the United States, which I think are equally valid in other contexts, are providing grants to local law enforcement so that they can better understand how to identify a hate crime and also streamline their ability to report on it. So the FBI publishes every year a list of the types of hate crimes by the place where they were perpetrated. That data comes from local law enforcement who are not required by law to report it, and so those that have the resources to and for whatever reason want to report it do. But there are 82 or 83, don't quote me on the exact number, I think around 83 cities around the United States that are 100,000 people or more in those cities where they either reported last year that they had no hate crimes or they didn't report whether they had hate crimes or not. That's obviously, in both cases, ludicrous, and we're not if that were terrorism incidents, it would be a national emergency. But because it's kind of in some cases, unfortunately, viewed as a lesser crime or a lesser threat, we don't kind of look at it, at the same level of urgency. And so finding ways to increase, again, the transparency of kind of who is reporting, but also that an officer could call something vandalism and just vandalism and not a hate crime because they don't know how to identify them. So increasing the ability of sort of those on the ground to do that and create that data to sort of help incentivize the urgency so that we can create these types of programs and look at them. So again, we try our best to provide comprehensive data. There's some challenges to doing that, and like I said, the government needs to have its own comprehensive data if it's going to be set to kind of address, put its resources toward proportionally to the threat.
Well, when we compiled the Global Terrorism Index, we of course used the GTD, but from the GTD we only use those cases that are 100% identified as terrorist attacks. So those where there is a doubt about is it a terrorist attack or not, we do not take them into the Global Terrorism Index. We concentrate basically on the tactic that is used, that is called terrorism, which is a crystallization of other forms of violence. And we see that when terrorism is used, is usually in an environment where other forms of violence have been used before. I would say we can have this luxury at the Institute for Economics and Peace because we know that we measure all the other forms of violence into our Global Peace Index. So anyhow, we measure those other forms of violence in another publication that we produce, in which terrorism is one of the 23 indicators. And I think I really like your question also because it's a matter of perspective. We are going to release early 2020 a national peace index for one of the European countries, and one of the amazing results that we saw there is that this country, when presenting the crime figures, where they include all types of crime, like I would say fraud or white-collar crime, you could have an impression that this country is doing very well because those figures or those results were decreasing over the past years. When you apply the system of looking at the use of violence instead of crime as such, you will see that this country was basically increased the use of violence over the past year. So you really see contradictory results if you look at crime as such, or the use of violence in those crimes, or the use of violence within this society. So I really like your question because you really made the point that is very, very important. But terrorism is only, I would say, crystallization of other forms of crime, and we have seen in many regions of the world, latent use of violence that can then emerge into the use of a tactic that is called terrorism, and that's where we focus on.
And perhaps just to add one dimension that hasn't been mentioned yet, which is relevant for us when it comes to the UN Security Council and the types of terrorism crimes that it would then put on its agenda. There, the decisive factor is the international dimension, right? Whether it is a purely domestic phenomenon or whether there are international links. And I think that is one very important dimension when it comes to the extreme right that we are grappling with right now in terms of understanding to what extent there are these international connections and how they actually work, and there are many challenges in that. And I mean, we discussed this issue of the tendency for there to be less affiliation with one particular group and a less sort of centralized network, and that poses then challenges in terms of understanding, well, but so how are these individuals and groups actually connected? And the point that Ryan also made about the need to sort of further understand the online space in that context. I mean, that is still a huge challenge and something that we're looking at, and sort of how, there is ideological spread, but to what extent there is also something more organized when it comes to financing, when it comes to recruitment issues and other points. So that for us is the critical distinction.
So I'm going to go to the two questions from Twitter, and then we'll come back to the audience. I realize we are a little bit behind our original end time, but we started about 15 minutes late. If people have to leave, please feel free to do so, but we're going to go for about another 10 minutes. So the first question is for Serge from Twitter. We don't have identification of the person, but their question is, what role can achieving the Sustainable Development Goals play in terrorism? Would this help to mitigate the conditions that violent extremists migrate to? And then the second question is for both Aaron and Serge, and the question is, how is data verified locally, especially for more controversial findings, such as, do Nigerians believe the term Fulani extremists accurately reflect violence on the ground?
Well, let me start by the second question. We are very, very careful when we talk about what's happening in Nigeria. We recognize, I mean, this is exactly what I said in my previous answer. We recognize in Nigeria there are multiple forms of violence, organized or non-organized, international influence or national forms of violence. And we see that, of course, this opposition between, I would say, pastoral people or groups of people and herders fighting for the same resources, land and water, can sometimes crystallize in the use of terrorism. So I think it would be a mistake to use the term Fulani extremists. It would be the same mistake to say that the ideologically Salafist-inspired Islamist form of terrorism are the Muslims. I would say it would be the same mistake. Fulanis are a much larger group of population, of which a very small fringe is using violence and is using then the crystallization of violence that is called terrorism. Can you please repeat the first one, because I was so concentrated on the second one I forgot the first.
On SDGs.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is a question making my point about creating the goal of the SDGs is to promote development, and positive peace is an innovative form of development. So I guess the goal of both the SDGs and positive peace is to create those more resilient societies, just, equal and equitable societies in which the use of violence would not be a way to settle disputes or to address grievances. And IIP has been doing a lot of research on the SDGs and the measurement of the SDGs. And unfortunately, we came to the conclusion that only 40% of all the indicators for the SDGs would be tier 1, so in which data is available and data is usable to measure the application of those SDGs. And basically what we say at IEP is that the positive peace index and the levels of positive peace can be used as kind of a surrogate for those indicators of the SDGs that are not measurable at the moment.
So the question about how to describe violence in Nigeria and the people who are carrying out violence in Nigeria is a really important one. I think that in terms of how we verify the data, so all of the data are based on media accounts. We do assess the sort of the degree to which there's any bias in the sources and incorporate that into the data collection process. Specifically with respect to Nigeria, I think there have been some criticisms of the use of the term Fulani extremist in the Global Terrorism Database to describe violent actors in Nigeria for certain attacks. I'll say two things. The second one is far more important, I think, than the first one. The first one is that we do not try to impose terms from a sort of top-down approach on in terms of characterizing actors. We draw information from the source materials. We use source materials that are as independent as possible and not sort of identified with either the state or violent non-state actors. So that's the first thing. So we repeat the terminology that we see reflected in the media sources. Sometimes that's okay, and sometimes that's problematic. The second thing is the far more important thing, which is that in the GTD, we have certain sort of perpetrators that are identified by an ethnicity or a religion, and that's because that's the only information we have about the perpetrators. Under no circumstances ever, for any place in the world, Nigeria or elsewhere, should anyone take that to be an indication that reflects on that broader group of people, whether it is the Fulani people, vast majority of whom are not carrying out terrorist attacks, whether it is Iraqi extremists in Northern Ireland. We have attacks attributed to Republican extremists. Under no circumstances is that a reflection on that broader group that broader identity group that we're making a reference to. It is only meant to describe that people who are carrying out this particular attack are identified as, in the case of Nigeria, often as Fulani people. And it's important, again, and just if I can emphasize, this is applicable for all of the sort of more generic identifiers, that we don't have a particular formal organization that is identified as the perpetrator of these attacks across the board, that is not meant to reflect more broadly on that particular identity group, whether it's race, ethnicity, religion, anything.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, we only okay.
I think for Nigeria, what is more important to understand for Nigeria is the redistribution of the impact of terrorism in different regions of Nigeria. So we saw a clear effort by the security force in the northeast tackling Boko Haram, and you saw the figures on my slides before. But while doing so, they were unable to, I would say, maintain peace and security in other parts of Nigeria, being the Middle Belt or the Niger Delta. So you clearly see almost a balance between there where the effort is put and where the concentration of the effort is put, and on the other end, other regions where violence can emerge, because there is not an influence on the security forces.
Very helpful. So we only have a few minutes left, so if anybody has questions, we'll take all of them, and then we will both answer questions and give last word up here. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm not going to be able to get 5. So if anyone wants to take back their question, let me know. Otherwise, the first 4 that I saw.
Hey, how you doing? Eric Vanek. I'm the fellow from the Army War College here at the U.S. Institute of Peace. Thanks for your time today. I've done a lot of work within, this is phenomenal, the amount of data that you have here and boiling this down. I can't imagine how long this takes, but it really does inform a lot within DOD, and I'm sure within state aid and all the other individuals that are trying to really make stuff happen, as well as CONUS. My question to you is, you mentioned, Serge, through terrorism and shootings, it dramatically increased from 1982 to present, I believe. And I get it. I understand some of the numbers there. But as we, can you add any fidelity to? Do you guys take into account population growth? One of the things that we always have trouble with in the Army is suicide rates and relative populations. I imagine you guys might be going through some of the same analytics. I know it's a very empirical question, but it kind of helps us understand, I think, a little bit more of the data going forward. Thanks.
Thank you.
My name is Teresa Welsh. I'm a reporter with DevX. This question is for Serge. I was wondering if you would talk a little bit more about the economic impact of terrorism, particularly in conflict states that are already struggling, with generating business, gaining private investment, et cetera, and sort of how that, reverberates across society and has a negative impact. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Rachel Stromstad, recent graduate. You discussed a little bit about the impact of the internet in your presentation, and I was wondering if you could further explain that and talk about some of the long-term impacts of that on the research in the future, per se.
It's my pleasure being to the US IP. My name is Ledung Pai. I'm from Nigeria, but I stay in Virginia. So my questions, I just want to ask whether the US IP is there any structure like maybe a field peace initiative that maybe they sent. They have sent, or is on the ground. Maybe they sent to any country or any conflict zone. You have to keep peace among people, because most of this domestic violence migrated or generated to terrorists.
Should I go first?
I'm going to let this one add.
Right, last one.
Hello. Paul Sutphin from CNO Resources, consulting firm, long-term State Department. Thank you. Part of the report's purpose is to be prospective and to use as a basis for offering advice. A lot of the terrorism solutions you've discussed in what we've done are very kinetic, but we have some clear parts of the aftermath of terrorism out there, and I'm wondering if you can give some advice on how to deal with them or what you see they may cause, specifically the tens of thousands of interned ISIS fighters in Syria and many tens of thousands of family members where there's no obvious solution and every state's trying to pass the buck on how to deal with this. If you could maybe draw something from your report or research on what that means for us unless we deal with it.
So I'll have Serge go, but let me just quickly tick them off so people know what they're answering. The first is how do we account for population growth? The second is the economic impact in conflict zones. The third is on the internet. The fourth is on peace building directly in Nigeria. And the fifth is on the aftermath of terrorism.
First question, we use rate and percentages, so we look at the amount of those type of attacks per 100,000 or so. I mean, I don't know if I really got your question, but yeah, I mean, this is how you basically avoid the impact of this fluctuation in population. About the economic impact, so the economic impact that you saw is 33 billion. This is directly related to the 4 indicators that we use because that's what we can measure. So the amount of people killed, injured, and of course the damage that is caused to property. What we do not include in there is, I would say, the indirect economic impact because it's very, very difficult to calculate it on a statistical basis. And also the investment made in counterterrorism, I would say the extra investment made in security and intelligence services, because those data are just confidential or secret, so we don't have access to this. So this 33 billion, I would say, is only a portion of the real economic impact, and it's focusing on the indicators that we use and that we can count and measure. The internet, I think, in February this year, I was at the Munich Security Conference, and we had a side event having basically around the table all major international organizations dealing with counterterrorism. And I will not mention which one, but one of those organizations said that cyber terrorism did not exist. And I was like, whew. At the really beginning of the session, I was like, well, this is going to be a difficult session. What this person meant is that cyberspace has not been used yet to commit an attack. And I would say my answer to that is yeah, that's right. But everything before the real attack is done on the internet. So from radicalization, recruitment, training, command and control, name it, it's already done on the internet and it's already done online. And what we also see is an evolution of what you could call the cyber caliphates, in which what is not possible anymore on the ground will now be done online. I think when you look at the terrorist groups or this type of organizations, especially when they are crushed like ISIL at the moment, what they are looking for is this low input, high output type of attacks, or at least investment. And I think the internet is the best environment to do so. For Nigeria, I spoke about positive peace a lot today, also in kind of a PVE type approach. We are doing workshops. We are training people in positive peace. We have a network of, at the moment, more than 1,500 IP ambassadors scattered around the world that are supporting this initiative. Personally, I trained young Libyans, trying to, train them in positive peace to create a better future for Libya. We are negotiating now with Iraq, especially in northeastern Iraq and the Kurdish part of Iraq, Jordan. So that's in my region. So this region, the MENA region, most impacted by terrorism, is really receiving this idea of preventing and training in positive peace. For Nigeria, I think for the first time this year, we were able to, with one of those peace ambassadors, do a GTI launch per Skype in Lagos, Nigeria. This has been very well received, and all the participants wanted to invest more into peace and positive peace. And I really hope and I pray for us to be able to have this type of positive peace training in your country also in the near future. At IP, we have an office in Harare, Zimbabwe, that is responsible, I would say, for the southern part or the middle part of Africa, and the responsibility is distributed between me and my colleague in Harare. I kind of forgot a little bit to your point. Is what was the fifth one?
What to do in the aftermath of terrorism with situations like El Hol and others.
What that may mean for our policy going forward.
Yeah. All right. So yeah, I mean, yeah. Okay. Last year, one slide on the presentation last year was focusing on the response to foreign terrorist fighters and reintegrating those persons into your society. And we clearly saw that Western countries would focus more on imprisonment and incrimination of the activities of those people, where countries that would be more into the regions affected, or countries where Islam was the main religion of representing the main religion in this country, would go more for reintegration for those type of persons. I think what we need to look at there is the socio-economic environment in which those and the governance environment in which those countries are at the moment. When you take Tunisia, for example, where Tunisia is the smallest country of the region, but sent most of the foreign terrorist fighters to Syria and Iraq, more than 5,000. I'm not sure that those 5,000 were all crazy jihadists, as we can have a representation of those people, but I'm pretty sure that a large percentage of those young men and women leaving Tunisia to go and serve the Islamic State, we in the West would call them expats, trying to find a better future, trying to find a job, and the Islamic State was offering a lot of jobs, and not only as a fighter or as a terrorist fighter, but also in constructing the caliphate, in constructing the Islamic State. So I guess that's what we need to, there is another type of approach to returning foreign terrorist fighters or people that were in those camps. Pretty clear, I'm pretty with you when you say it's a responsibility of the states of origin of those fighters, of those persons. I think in Europe we were really well placed when somebody else was taking care of those persons instead of us. And now we are directly facing the problem, and you clearly see that the answers are completely different. And also throughout Europe, we see a different type of answer, and this really goes from a very hard answer, like you come back, you're jailed, we don't want to see you anymore, and you're not part of society. And then this would go to the other direction. Countries like Denmark that foresee an entire process of de-radicalization and reintegration within society.
Anyone else want to chime in?
Sorry, I'll just do the sort of online radicalization question because I brought that up. If you look at over 50 people killed because they were Muslim in Christchurch, New Zealand, there was someone killed in Poway, California because they were Jewish, and then over 20 people killed in El Paso, Texas because they were immigrants or members of the Latinx community. So one attack, 2 attacks in the United States, 1 overseas, and 1 attack against the Latinx community, 1 against Jews, 1 against Muslims. What they all had in common was before the attack, a white supremacist manifesto was posted online on 8chan. In the case of the Pittsburgh Tree of Life attack, the largest anti-Semitic attack in U.S. history, the perpetrator there posted to Gab, a far-right extremist social media outlet, before his attack. I'm reminded of START had a great report actually a few years ago about as foreign fighters are more likely to use social media, the time of radicalization is going down, right? And then you have these 3 white supremacist manifestos all citing similar information and sometimes citing each other, and all of them most of them cited Anders Breivik, who was the 2011 perpetrator of the attack in Norway, and then Brenton Tarrant, who perpetrated the Christchurch attack, was cited in the others. And so you have, in our data, these people would be sort of tagged as lone actors, and yet they're all citing each other and are part of the same movement, and that movement is now sort of, escalating in threat at the speed of the internet. Right. At the same time, we did a study that looked at, when Twitter kicks a lot of people off of their platform, they then join Gab, and then they sort of become sort of angry. They add Twitter to the reason that they have a grievance that's part of their sort of radicalization grievance narrative, right? And then in the case of 8chan is, people who were on Reddit were too controversial, they got kicked off, they joined 4chan. They're too controversial, they got kicked off, they joined 8chan and created 8chan. Then 8chan service providers pulled its service, then it got new service providers, came back online, then those service providers pulled its service, and and then it came back as 8kun, 8kun. So now it's largely back. And so I think the story that tells is that, as much as it would sound like a solution to just sort of delete objectionable content, it is at best a partial solution, and at worst kind of could exacerbate some of the problems. And so when I say, we need to pay careful attention to the role of the internet, it's radicalization, it's coordination. In some cases, someone posting a manifesto on 8chan helps law enforcement, because then they know, oh, there's something that's about to happen and I know roughly where to look, so it might actually help them interdict someone before they commit an attack. We saw, for instance, an individual in Las Vegas who was posting openly online that he wanted to attack our Las Vegas office. So we reported that to law enforcement. So he was interdicted before that became a sort of proper manifesto, right? And so there's that. There's wanting to counter the objectionable content without becoming part of the grievance narrative that makes the problem worse. So there's Facebook has a policy where they will in some cases refer people that they see on their platform to Life After Hate, the former neo-Nazis that now pull people out of that group. So that's another kind of type of solution that can be explored rather than content moderation per se. And so I think this is an expedited version of a complex answer to say that the internet has just fundamentally changed how these problems manifest, but there's an incredible amount of nuance that we have to that we use both in how we assess the internet as part of the problem, and also how we assess what the potential solutions are.
So I just wanted to come back to the question on the aftermath of terrorism and the question of return, because I mean, it is really important to bear in mind that we do have a sort of internationally agreed normative framework on this, and we have policy guidance and we have Security Council resolutions that talk about the need for all states to put in place prosecution, rehabilitation, and reintegration strategies. And so, of course, we have seen some variation in terms of how that is being done specifically. And there is, of course, still a lot of controversial debate around the specific issue of proactive repatriation of some of these individuals. But I think it is very important to stress that we do have policy guidance. We do also have practice when it comes to this issue, and not only in the context of ISIL, but also in the context of other terrorist groups where return is of course a major policy question, and how to handle that. And so on that issue, I just wanted to add that when we look at the current situation with ISIL, one of the messages that we're not really getting out, especially in those countries that are currently very reluctant in terms of how to handle this situation, is that we've had a large number of returns, that we've had both countries who have proactively repatriated their citizens, and prior to that, we have, of course, had a large number of independent returns from all demographics. So a lot of the male fighters who have returned and who have been dealt with in their national systems, either through the criminal justice process, where it was possible to prosecute them, where they then serve prison sentences, and the rehabilitation work starts in those prison settings, right? As well as in alternative settings, non-criminal justice settings. And there have also been success stories in terms of how some of those cases have been handled. And so I think it is important to remind ourselves of that. I find one of the statistics that you highlighted in the GTI actually very striking in that context. We know that right now there is a very large number of women who remain in the camps in northern Syria, and European states have been particularly reluctant when it comes to the repatriation of that demographic. And you have one figure in there that actually talks about Europe and says that 50% of male foreign terrorist fighters from Europe have actually returned, whereas the rate for women is 18%. And so that goes to show, well, if we have been able to somehow address the situation of those male fighters, then surely we will also be able to find the right means and ways of dealing with the women and children who are in that situation that is really untenable in the way that it is, both for humanitarian and for long-term security reasons. But this question of return, I do also want to make the point that that is really something, if we're looking at some of the age groups that we're dealing with and how young many of these individuals were, this is really a generational challenge that we're looking at. This is not an issue that we'll just be able to resolve with a quick fix and finding a magical solution for this current situation. And so this is why I think it is very important, as you said, that this is seen as a collective responsibility that we all share, right? I mean, we've had citizens from literally across the whole world travel to the conflict zone in Syria and Iraq, and we saw that as a collective security challenge. And that collective challenge now continues and will continue for many years in terms of how we address and deal with it.
Thanks so much. So as a moderator, you have a couple jobs to do. The first is to start on time, which I failed. The second was to end on time, which I failed. The third, however, is to invite excellent panelists, which I think I did okay on. And the fourth is to not opine too much. And so far, I've been pretty less opinionated than my natural state would normally belie. But I have to comment on this last question, sir. So here at the Institute of Peace, we are launching an initiative focused on violent extremism, disengagement, and reconciliation, trying to see both the individual and how they disengage, as well as the community level and how they reconcile, because what we've discovered through research and through years of practice in and outside of violent extremism is that belonging to an ideologically motivated group is inherently a social activity. And so your reconnection back to social groups, which has been alluded to with regard to the far right and how you're able to have identities as part of a group identity, that social aspect is incredibly important. We know this through decades of peace building, that new social identities can overtake old social identities. And so we're really excited to be able to focus on that. The other thing that is part of that focus is on trauma and stigma, both the trauma of the individuals as well as the stigmatization and how those are barriers to that type of engagement. And the last thing I'll say, because I have Alexandra here, is trying to understand how violent extremist groups from all different types of the spectrum have become gender experts. They are excellent at reifying the gendered identities and roles and responsibilities of men and women, and how do we do that in our rehabilitation and reintegration efforts as well. I would like to give a big thanks to everybody who has stuck around, who's been with us online, and please join me in thanking our panelists. I'll also let you know that there are surveys on your chair. If you would be kind enough to be able to fill those out, we would deeply appreciate it. If you need pens, I believe that we have some additional ones. And if you'd like to stay involved with us here at USIP, please feel free to get in touch. Thank you so much again, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Maybe. Yeah, thank you.
Beautiful. I mean, that's. You still work. So I don't care where I still work. I can't guarantee that. If they say it's okay, make a copy of them, yeah.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. I don't expect you to have done it a lot, so don't worry about it. There's no judgment in not having it.
Let's start putting
Yeah. No.